everybody, and welcome to your Top Human Rights Organization Review. I am your host, Bryce Dolan. Now today we're going to cover 5 of your top human rights organizations, and we're going to follow a story from each organization. Now first we're going to begin the show with Human Rights Watch and the suppression of critics in Chechnya before the upcoming election in September. Next we'll visit Iraq with Amnesty International, and we see an increase in executions but no decrease in security threats. Next, we'll take a look at Yemen, where the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, was finally able to send vital medical supplies to those in need. And then we'll move over to the International Federation for Human Rights, as they call for investigations of human rights violations in Ethiopia. And then we'll end the show as the NRC calls on Europe to help put an end to the rising deaths of refugees on their doorsteps. Now to begin, in Moscow, local authorities are attempting to silence even the slightest critics before the election on September 18, 2016 for the head or governor of Chechnya. Now Human Rights Watch released a 56-page report titled, "Like Walking a Minefield, Vicious Crackdown on Critics in Russia's Chechen Republic." This describes how local authorities punish and humiliate those who oppose or seem reluctant to applaud the Chechen leadership and its policies. The report also details increasing threats, assaults, and detention of journalists and human rights defenders. Now, Chechen authorities are tyrannizing critics and anyone whose total loyalty to the local leadership they think is questionable, said Tanya Lokshina, the Russia program director at Human Rights Watch. She also added, under the circumstances, it's very difficult to see how the election in Chechnya can be free and fair. Now, back in 2007, the Kremlin appointed the current leader of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, after bloody conflict with armed separatist groups. Well, this September will actually be the first time Kadyrov's authority will be put to a direct vote. Now, with the suppression of the critics, who is to say how accurate these votes are going to be? However, the local authorities' severe and sweeping crackdown seems designed to remind the Chechen public of Kadyrov's total control and to contain the flow of any negative information from Chechnya that could undermine the Kremlin's support for Kadyrov. Now, reading through the article, Human Rights Watch tells us that a number of cases of people who have suffered the consequences of criticizing the government. Not only the critics, but their families have suffered as well. The abuse we documented sends an unequivocal message of intimidation to the public in Chechnya and may be only the tip of the iceberg, said Lokshina. Some abuses never come to light because the climate of fear in Chechnya is overwhelming and local residents have been largely intimidated into silence. Now, Russia and Putin need to put an end to this immediately. No more turning a blind eye to violent, cruel human rights violations. Now next, Amnesty International takes us over to Iraq, where 36 men were executed on August 21st, along with a continued increase of executions as a result of a dramatic security threat the country is currently facing. Well, the men were convicted of killing 1,700 military cadets at Spiker military camp in June of 2014. While their conviction came after a deeply flawed mass trial that only lasted a few hours. And the convictions also relied on confessions that were extracted under torture. Now, these mass executions mark a chilling increase in Iraq's use of the death penalty, said Lynn Malouf, the Deputy Director for Research at Amnesty International's Middle East and North Africa Regional Office. Time and time again, Amnesty International has emphasized that victims' families have the right to truth and called for justice for the atrocities committed by the armed group calling itself the Islamic State. However, executing men who were forced to confess under torture and were not given a proper chance to defend themselves is not justice. Now, only thorough, fair, and transparent trials will deliver justice for victims of deadly attacks and their families. Now, Amnesty International is calling on Iraqi authorities to temporarily stop these executions and eventually abolish the death penalty altogether. To give you an idea of how forced these confessions were, one of the men who were executed confessed to killing 60 cadets at the military camp. Well, after receiving threats that his wife and sisters would be raped, he confessed to those killings. He was also beaten with cables and given electric shocks, and video evidence actually shows the man being punched in the face during interrogation and confessing on Iraqi TV with a visible bruise under his right eye. Now, even though he recanted this confession in court, according to lawyers, it was used to justify its verdict. Now, the court did not order an independent investigation into his and other defendants' allegations of torture. So, those men that were executed, maybe some of them were involved, maybe some weren't. But that needs to stop now. Now, moving on to the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross. They were able to send a plane carrying vital medical supplies to thousands in need in Yemen. The cargo of 130,000 vials of insulin will be administered immediately to help improve the quality of life for people who are suffering from diabetes. Now, people with chronic diseases are often forgotten during times of conflict. At this time in Yemen, there is a severe shortage of medications for these people. This insulin cargo will help thousands of diabetics whose suffering has been heightened since the conflict started, said the head of the ICRC in Yemen, Alexandre Fate. Now, it is estimated that around 900,000 Yemenis suffer from diabetes. An overwhelming majority of them depend on daily doses of insulin. Now, along with the 130,000 vials that have arrived by plane, in the next couple weeks, 70,000 more vials of insulin are expected to arrive by boat in Aden and be distributed in southern parts of the country. The insulin cargo we have brought in today complements other efforts we are undertaking to address some of the severe shortages of medical supplies in the country. Less than 30% of the required medicines and medical supplies have entered Yemen in 2015, said Mr. Fate. Now, moving on to the International Federations for Human Rights, also known as the FIDH. They are calling the world's attention again to Ethiopia. A group of civil society organizations are calling for an independent and impartial international investigation into human rights violations in Ethiopia, including the unlawful killing of peaceful protesters and a recent spate of arrests of civil society members documenting this crackdown. Now, since last month, 4 members of one of Ethiopia's most prominent human rights organizations, the Human Rights Council, were arrested and detained in the Amhara and Oromia regions. Now, the HRCO believes these arrests are related to the members' monitoring and documentation of the crackdown of ongoing protests in these regions. Now, there are a number of journalists and activists who are currently being detained with no formal charges and denial to see any family or a lawyer. Now, new levels of violence are being reported in the crackdown on the largely peaceful protests that have taken place across Oromia and Amhara regions in recent weeks. Instead of investigating and holding accountable those responsible for rights violations, the government is jailing the few independent human rights defenders left working in the country, said Hassan Shire, the executive director of Defend Defenders. Now, Amnesty International reported that close to 100 protesters were killed and scores more arrested during these largely peaceful protests. The lack of independent and transparent investigation of human rights violations in Ethiopia strongly implies that the Ethiopian government's investigation of the ongoing human rights crisis will not be independent, impartial, and transparent. It is time to step up efforts for an international and independent investigation in Ethiopia. This was said by Sarah Jackson, the Amnesty International's Deputy Regional Director for East Africa, the Horn, and the Great Lakes. Now, to end the show, the Norwegian Refugee Council will not let the deaths of thousands be ignored by Europe. I know we touched on this a couple days ago about the death of Aylan Kurdi. This kind of has to do with the same thing, but again, we're calling more attention to it because thousands and thousands of people are dying as they are just trying to escape the conflicts and complications of war. 1 year after the death of Aylan Kurdi, the hemorrhage of human lives on the doorstep to Europe has worsened, warned the Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council, Jan Egeland. Now, European leaders promised action, and countries promised to fulfill their moral responsibilities. But instead of building bridges, they have built walls, and instead of taking their share of responsibility, they have participated in a race to the bottom. Now, European civilization, or lack thereof, is defined by how we receive prosecuted human beings seeking our protection, he added. I know we touched on this once before, but I agree with the NRC that this issue really needs attention, ladies and gentlemen. This week marks 1 year since the tragic death of Aylan Kurdi, the Syrian child who was found drowned on a beach in Turkey. The photo of the young boy created a wave of sympathy with the world's refugees. In August, the photo of Omran Daknish from Aleppo became another symbol of the children's suffering. Now, the Norwegian Refugee Council hopes people again will mobilize in support of refugees in the same way as we witnessed last autumn. Now, since the death of Aylan Kurdi, more than 4,000 people have lost their lives in the Mediterranean on their way to Europe. Among them are hundreds of children. European leaders must do more to prevent new tragedies. We must welcome a much larger number of refugees for resettlement in Europe and increase humanitarian assistance to people affected by war and conflict, not only in Syria, but also in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, and South Sudan, said Egeland. Now, ladies and gentlemen, like I said, a couple days ago, we did a segment on Aylan Kurdi, same top human rights organization too, with the NRC, the Norwegian Refugee Council. That's because this is an issue. Europe needs to let these people in. Last year, they said they would claim to let in thousands of refugees. They have let in 5% of what they have been expected to let in this last year. 5%, ladies and gentlemen. Now, here's what we gotta ask ourselves. Why aren't they helping? What are they scared of? These are people too. Refugees are people too. They need help. They just want to find a place that's peaceful and free so they can go about living their lives like the rest of us. So why is Europe so strong and so adamant about detaining these people and not letting them through? I get the fear of terrorism. I get the fear of ISIS and the fear of attacks because of what happened in Nice, what happened in Paris. I get it. But that doesn't mean you automatically label that everybody that comes from that part of the country is a terrorist too. So you can't be afraid to let them in and help them. They need our help, ladies and gentlemen. And the rest of the world is doing nothing about it, and we are the only ones that can. So you might be hearing about this topic a little bit more, actually, as we post some more videos. We will try to stay on that topic, but different articles, so we don't cover the same information. But we are going to keep our attention on that until hopefully Europe changes their ideals and starts letting more people in. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you can find the link to all these articles below in the description. Please give us a like on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. But this was your Top Human Rights Organization Review, and I was your host, Bryce Dolan.